White to the stage. David, welcome up. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. When Patrick invited me to this event, I had no idea what multifamily was. I hate to admit that. I shouldn't admit that publicly. I come from the tech world. But as I've done a little bit of research, a little bit of homework, not much, but a little bit, I have learned that multifamily is really a fascinating sort of tranche or domain of business and society, because the multifamily world, as you know, cuts across almost every facet of society, from technology to obviously real estate, to livelihoods, to economy, and then to social norms and social issues and people. I'm talking about the impact of your clients as well as, of course, your own organizations. So I was very excited to accept the invite to come down here to Phoenix and talk to you all and hopefully learn something as well. Because what I want to talk about today is a very new area of organizational change and business change. We're learning a lot about culture and business transformation, and especially in the last 30 years with the advent of neuroscience and all the advances in neuroscience. And so here to share some of that with you today, and hopefully you'll find it relevant and applicable to your worlds. So I want to begin by just asking a really basic question. Show of hands, how many of you are involved right now, either as participants or leading or both, what you would consider a major organizational transformation? Show of hands. A few of you. Now, those of you that didn't raise your hands, I'm assuming then that everything's cool, no change, status quo, life is good, right? Okay. Of those that did raise your hands, just a few of you just kind of shout out, what is the nature of the transformation you're going through? Like, what's changing? What's going on? Generational, yeah. Identity, is that what you said? Like of the employees, of the company, identity of the company. Cool, yeah. Others. Growth? Like just expansion? Yeah. Leveling up people? Yeah, okay. Say again? The economy, yeah. Yeah, the economy is forcing us, right? Yeah, obviously demographic shifts are dramatic. Nobody mentioned anything related to technology, digital. Okay. Yeah, technology, right, is changing our lives indelibly. So of those that are involved in leading transformation, and even if you're not, if you're on the sidelines watching transformation, either for yourselves or for your clients, your customers, I'd like to share with you first a few little interesting facts about the nature of transformation, sort of the transformation world as it is, and then find out a little bit more from you as we go. So first off, a few interesting numbers. So 89. So how many of you were in the workforce prior to 1995? We won't embarrass anybody here, but okay. Those of you that were working in companies, like earning a paycheck before 1995, are part of the world before the so-called digital revolution. So those of you that were working after 95, working in companies, and companies that were born after 1995 are so-called digital native companies. So this 89 figure applies really to all of those businesses that are not in the digital space, that are realizing that basically they have to become digital or digital-first businesses, whatever that means. Either your primary revenue is digital, it comes from digital sources, or you're needing to automate processes and practices that were never automated in the past, etc. The world is changing, and it's changing because of our digital technology. Now, 70 is another interesting figure, the number of digital transformations that fall short of stated goals. So even while the world is changing quickly, most organizations that are attempting some form of digital transformation are finding it really hard. And we're going to talk about why that is today. Here's an interesting figure, 5673. So 56 years ago was the first formal study of organizational change failure rates. 56 years ago at MIT. And that failure rate then was around 73%, about 3/4 of all planned organizational change, however you want to define organizational change, about 73% of them fail. And that number has stayed pretty much the same for 56 years. Rather remarkable. We can debate how change is measured and what defines change, but however you define change, major planned change in organizations of any kind, most of it doesn't work out exactly as you had planned. That figure for me was what led me at the age of 48 to go back to graduate school and get a PhD, because I had, for about 30 years, been working in large organizations, large and small, as well as being an entrepreneur in a software company, and realizing that every major change that I had been a part of, organizational change, whether as a participant or as a leader, didn't work. They failed. So I went back to school at 48 to get a PhD to try to figure this out. Like, why does so much change fail in organizations? Great ideas, great strategy, brilliant leaders, committed people, committed workforce, all the technology you could possibly want. I mean, I worked at Microsoft, and still failure. And so the two things that I learned from that experience, that PhD experience, one is that one of the main reasons why change fails is this hard thing called culture. And the second thing I learned is that nobody knows what the hell culture is. You ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers. And guess what? They're all right. Everybody has their own idea of what culture is, and it's equally right and valid. The problem is that we don't know a lot about culture, and culture seems to be the thing that gets in the way a lot when it comes to change of any scale, of any kind. So, a survey by our friends at Booz, the consulting firm, 84% of senior executives believe culture is critically important to their companies and to organizational change, and most companies do a poor job of managing it. Another interesting factoid. And then our consulting friends at Boston Consulting Group have this 5X figure that those companies that are able to actually prioritize culture transformation in their business transformations, tend to do better. Now, that might just sound like motherhood and apple pie and obvious, but it's a lot easier said than done. So here's where the new science of culture comes in and why this stuff, at least to me, is important. So I'd like to find out more, though, from you all about what is going on in your world of transformation. And I know many of you didn't raise your hands, but I'm going to force you now to take out your phones or computers and ask yourself this question: what is blocking your organizational transformation? And if you don't know, that's fine, you don't know. If you don't think you're involved in any transformation, then think about your clients or your customers or other companies that you know. What is getting in the way of organizational transformation from where you sit in the world? And I'm going to have you go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and you'll see a code, 79961280. Go to menti.com on your phones, type in that code, and we're going to, together, generate a little word cloud to see what you think blocks your organizational transformation. You don't have to keep entering. If you want to create a laundry list, that's fine. We can keep going. Okay. So this is fascinating. You all seem to have a very good pulse, a good handle on what's going on in your organizational worlds. So I'm impressed. I'm going to suggest to you that what you have on the screen here are symptoms, not causes. Symptoms, for the most part. And I'm going to, over the next 45 minutes or so, suggest to you why that is. So, I started out talking about culture. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a cognitive anthropologist. I study the relationship between the brain and culture. This is what I went back to school at 48 to get after 30 years in HR and HR-related technology companies. And so what I'm going to suggest to you is why these items that you have on that screen are symptoms is because they relate to something cultural and something deeply cultural that we want to explore today. Before we do that, let's go back to menti.com, same code, and ask an important question, kind of a basic question, but before we proceed, let's get our terms right. What is culture? Okay, what is culture? And you even have the old proverbial all the above and none of the above if you just want to sort of punt on that question. Also say, looking at these results, that they pretty much represent a good cross-section of popular views of what culture is in business. Values, behavior, how we do things around here, norms and attitudes, etc. And what's interesting also is that none of you selected tacit knowledge. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, so let me take you into the modern neuroscience of culture. And I will just preface by saying most of what I'm going to share with you today is not well known in the business world. We could spend a lot of time talking about why, but one of the reasons why is that a lot of what I'm going to share with you today comes from the world of anthropology and cognitive psychology and cognitive sociology. And these are domains, these are disciplines, these are literatures, these are faculties at universities that don't really care that much about business. They're not that interested in the capitalist world of making money, and they're more interested in studying societies at large in the grand scheme of things. So there's been a little bit of a trickle-down or cross-pollination, but one of the things that I realized in my PhD program is that there's a great opportunity to start to educate the business world and the business community about what's going on in the science of culture, the new science of culture, because a lot of what's been preached in business about what culture is and is not is just ideology. It's what I call the corporate culture movement, but it's kind of disconnected from the science, the modern science that goes on outside of the business schools. So I want to show you a little bit about what culture is not. This is not culture in the modern cognitive science perspective. It relates to culture, but it's not culture, this being how we feel about each other, our teamwork, our sense of community. These are nice things, they're important things, but it's not really kind of what culture is. It might be a symptom or a perspective on culture. This isn't culture either. The corporate values. They're very important. This is ideology. This is the espoused principles or values, usually of the leadership team. And it might be well believed, it might even be true for that group of people, but it's idealized. It isn't necessarily what's lived. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in what's lived, what's experienced, what's felt every day. I know some of you are football fans in here. I hate to break it to you. This also is not culture. It sounds good. And it relates to culture, and it might be super important for teamwork and team building and creating a great football team or a great orchestra or a great group of executives, but it ain't that simple, and it's not that linear. And it's not an equation. And if it was, I wouldn't be here right now talking to you because it would all be figured out and transformation rates, organizational transformation failure rates wouldn't be 73%, and we would all be living in a different world. Sorry, Urban. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have the T-shirts, with the slogans and all that, but it's not exactly the right way to think about culture because it doesn't really produce the desired outcomes. This also isn't culture. When you can't really say the IBM culture, the Microsoft culture, the Germans, the French, the Ugandans. These are stereotypes, these are tropes, these are broad categorizations. They might have tiny shreds of truth, but they're also misleading. They send us down wrong paths. Okay, so hopefully, at least if you're with me, you're kind of like, okay, so what the hell is he talking about? If this isn't culture, what the hell are we talking about here? I want to begin by suggesting that culture, from the modern perspective, looks more like this. Atoms. DNA might be another metaphor as well. So culture in organizations is highly complex. It's the least understood word in culture. And so what I'm going to try to suggest to you and convince you today, or at least have you entertained for a little while, is this idea that cultures are systems, and cultures are complex biological systems. At their core, they consist of multiple layers like any system, but at their core, they consist of these atomic particles. And these atomic particles are known as cultural models. In the social sciences, they're known as cultural models. What's a cultural model? A cultural model is a shared mental model. None of you selected tacit knowledge on that little survey, but the simplest way of saying it is culture is knowledge. Culture is stuff that you know that you don't know you know, but you use it every day, whether you know it or not, nonetheless. How do you know, for example, when you get into an elevator, that you don't stare at people in the eye? Culture. How do you know, when you go to a restaurant, how it works in the restaurant? If it says, please wait to be seated, how do you know? How do you just barge in and sit down wherever you want? Culture. How do you know when you land in the middle of the night in Accra, in Africa, how to get a taxi when there are no such things as taxis or signs or any instruction? Or you go to Shanghai and land at 3 a.m. and the reception hall outside baggage claim is filled with people yelling and screaming, but no idea how to find your ride or your taxi. Culture. Stuff that you don't know you know until you need to use it, or stuff that you don't know and you don't know it, but you feel like O-S-H-I-T when you need to use it. How do you know whether to kiss a woman in France on one cheek or two cheeks when you greet them, a stranger? You get the idea. Culture is what we call, at its root, a set of atomic particles, and I like to call them dominant logics. A dominant logic is a cultural model. I don't want to confuse you with a lot of terminology, but dominant logic seems to be a word that business people seem to resonate with because it's a logic. It makes sense in that community. What is a dominant logic? It's a set of shared mental models that are entirely taken for granted. They surface as assumptions or beliefs or idealizations about how the world works or should work. And it's entirely taken for granted. Our brains are fascinating and complex. We have so much knowledge and so much information in our head, and 90% of it we don't ever need to use. It's only that part that we need to use in context. So when you get into the elevator, you have cultural knowledge in context. But when you're not in the elevator, you don't need to think about whether you should stare at someone or not stare at someone. You get the idea. It's knowledge in context. The thing about dominant logics is not only are they the core of culture, but they organize an entire system around a set of beliefs. Again, these beliefs that we take for granted. This is what I want to get at when I talk about culture, because this is the stuff that keeps you where you are, and I want to explain why. Here's some examples. These are some examples of real companies in my research and their dominant logics. By the way, most organizations have many of these. Not unlimited, not infinite, but certainly 5 to 10 often. Now, you might say, well, gee, David, these sound a lot like, the corporate values or the principles or the things that we should be all doing. There's a difference. First off, these are not corporate values because these things are completely tacit or preconscious. Preconscious means you know it, you just don't need to know it until I ask you for it. I can't say to you, hey, what are your dominant logics? You probably wouldn't know the answer to that question unless I primed you or gave you some context. The other thing about these things is that they're widespread. They surface as patterns in organizational practices, and we're going to come back and spend some time on that. They're pervasive. You know a dominant logic when you see one because you see it everywhere. It's a pattern that surfaces in many different kinds of things that you do. And they influence the rest of culture, which is norms and attitudes and behavior. So those of you that selected all the above in that little poll are correct, but they're not the core. So one of the things I want to start to get everyone hip on this point is that when it comes to cultural systems, we need to diagnose symptom from disease. What's symptomatic of something else? And this is why cultures are complex, and this is why so much change fails, is because we don't get this right. Here's the other thing about dominant logics. Dominant logics are your friends. They come from very meaningful shared experience. They are actually why you are successful as a business. So these are not just bad things. These are things that actually are adaptive things. These concepts, these bits of knowledge are adaptive. They've helped you adapt to the world, to your business world. And as such, they're there to preserve the status quo. One of the things we know about culture over centuries, over millennia, is that cultures are adaptive systems. Humans invented culture to survive in a big, bad world. And the same is true in organizations. So they preserve the status quo. I do not want you to be thinking that that these dominant logics are something bad. However, like all good things, they have a dark side. And the dark side is the dominant logics are the reason why most major business transformations don't work. It's a deep structure that keeps you tethered to the status quo. Their cultures are designed to keep you exactly where you are. They were evolved that way. The human brain thinks of them that way. And so this is why your best friend is also your best enemy. And we need to get smart about why and when that is. So, to understand why, a brief little foray into the world of neuroplasticity. What's neuroplasticity? Anybody heard that word? Okay. Simple definition. Our brains are plastic. Not literally, but figuratively plastic, meaning our brains are made up of millions and millions and billions of neurons and chemical processes, and they are evolving and changing and dying and growing every single second of the day. Right now, you are killing neurons, and neurons are firing, and your brain processes are changing as we speak. One of the things that's really interesting about the neuroplasticity of culture is that until about 1980, it was believed that all brains stopped evolving at about the time of late adolescence. And then it was discovered that our chemical processes in our brains keep evolving and changing well into adulthood, in fact, up to the moment of death. We learn, and we are learning machines, and we are learning constantly well past adolescence. For many of you who've changed careers or have got more than one thing that you do professionally in your lives, you know this to be fundamentally true. You can learn stuff. You can learn stuff at 40, 60, and 80. And it's amazing. And that's because of this plastic brain. So the adult brain chemistry is shaped by many, many things. And I'm talking about adult brains, not just children's brains. Adult brains are shaped in many indelible ways by these 5 things in particular. Repetition and habit is a big one. You've heard about the 10,000 hours thing? It's true. Show of hands, how many of you are serious about a particular sport? Golf, tennis, whatever, gymnastics? Yeah. You know from time about what it takes to improve in your chosen sport. This is true of musicians. Anybody who's seriously devoted themselves to a craft or an art will know that time makes the difference. Meaningful experience. That could be anything. A meaningful experience of any kind will shape brain chemistry in really indelible ways, especially if it's sustained. I'll talk about that in a second, what that means. Expertise, becoming an expert in anything, is indelible to shaping cultures. This is why we have engineering cultures and sales cultures and lawyer cultures and surgeon cultures. Expertise, years and years of mastering something will shape the brain chemistry, and that shapes how you think. Tool use. You don't think social media is changing the way our brains are wired? The science is against you if you believe that. You don't think children's brains are being indelibly shaped by the hours spent gaming or on social media? The science is against you on that point. It's massive what is happening, and we don't really know what's happening over time to the amount of time that we spend staring at those little computers that we hold in our pockets now. Language also shapes brain chemistry, but interestingly, it's the weakest form of shaping. So those of you that think the corporate values, if we just publish them and say them, are going to change the culture, you're up against science, because language itself is not that powerful. And for it to be powerful, it has to be very artfully used, i.e., don't use stereotypes, don't use tropes, don't say things in different ways that people are not expecting to hear, and then you might start to actually get some brain chemistry. Otherwise, we tune it out. That's why corporate speak is so ineffectual at getting anything to happen in organizations. So these things shape neuronal connections, and these things are represented in our brains as what we call schemas. Schemas are just mental images. When we put a bunch of schemas together, we get these things called cultural models, and this is what dominant logics are. Okay, you don't really need to know all that, but here's what you do need to know, is that dominant logics in organizations come from many, many places, and this is really important for change leaders and change agents, because they originate through these neuroplastic processes in multiple shared experiences. For example, when an organization, when a group of people solve a really hard problem, that's a meaningful experience. That's a very meaningful experience. Microsoft solved the operating system. I came to Microsoft in around the year 2000, and believe me, the vestiges of having Bill and his team having created the DOS platform and then the Windows platform, the experiences, the values, the belief systems, the ways of speaking associated with that experience were evident to that day, 15 years later. We think at Microsoft in terms of platforms, we think in terms of operating systems, we think in terms of big, life-changing events and technologies. It was deeply embedded in the culture. So when you share an experience, and it's a meaningful experience of solving a really hard problem as a business, as a group, as a family, it will change brain chemistry. Existential moments in organizations will shape brain chemistry big time. I have a client, a defense contractor. When the US government went through its sequestration exercise a few years back, meaning they cut defense spending by like 50%, this company had to lay off 1,000 people. It was a 2,000-person company, had to lay off half its workforce. I joined as a consultant that company a few years after that, and the mark of that experience was deeply etched in that company. The company was maniacal about cost control, because those leaders vowed never to go through that kind of experience again and having to lay off half the workforce. It was traumatic. So trauma, what I call the existential moment. Many of you in your multifamily organizations, I'm sure, have had many existential moments, and that will shape brain chemistry. Professions. Think about in your multifamily world the different functions and professions in your business. IT, marketing, operations, sales, right? to the extent that those groups have had a professional experience, like years of training, years of apprenticeship, graduate programs. It doesn't have to be, though, professional. It can be, electricians. I mean, any trade that has anybody in a trade who spent a long time in that trade, mastering that trade, will have a professional identity, which is part of the brain chemistry and part of the culture. So professional groups, powerful professional groups and organizations will shape the dominant logics of the organization. Obviously, history. One of my clients is almost 160-year-old industrial company. The company was one of the units in that, one of the businesses in that company was founded in 1849. There is legacy. Legacy matters a lot as a shaper of dominant logics. Of course, regional influences, companies that are very rooted in certain parts of the world or certain parts of the country. This shapes dominant logics. And of course, last but not least, the founders' values. But this is a relatively weak influence unless the company remains a very small business. Research has shown that the orientations, the belief systems, the principles of founders is relatively weak. It doesn't get sustained unless it's embedded in business practices, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is where culture comes from. And it shapes the brain chemistry because of these kinds of experiences. And here's some examples. I'll give you just a few just to kind of illustrate for those of you that need examples. The IRS, our favorite entity in this country, right? In the business of tax collection, right? The hard problem they have solved is tax collection, no mean feat, right? Shapes dominant logics of detail checking and suspicion through the process of audit, right? And by the way, this is not just David making it up. This is based on research, right? An airlines are often obviously characterized by safety, but also efficiency, and tend to have dominant logics associated with speed and efficiency and safety, of course. Law firms. Anybody who spent any time in a law firm will know this. The process of litigation and advocacy tends to shape prevailing beliefs and assumptions around argument and win-lose, sort of binary ways of looking at the world. A consumer products company that's well-known, bringing products quickly into markets and having to think a lot about brand and brand value will tend to have dominant logics associated with market intelligence and also secrecy. And even Microsoft. I've done research on my own Microsoft experience and creating the operating system and creating software platforms and the software engineering professional groups have left Microsoft with deeply patterned ways of common thinking having to do with platforms and ecosystems and what we call intellectual horsepower. That's actually a competency that you get hired and you get selected at Microsoft based in part on this notion of intellectual horsepower. How quick is your brain? You don't get hired unless there's intellectual horsepower. It's a very controversial competency at Microsoft. But and also this notion of the stack. The computer stack is a prevailing schema at Microsoft. So what you do shapes how you think. That's the message here. Okay, so now back to menti.com, a different code this time. I'd like you just to reflect on what I've been saying for the last few minutes and ask yourselves in your organization, what are your dominant logics as you understand them? And again, this is not a quiz. There's no right or wrong. I'm just curious, kind of based on what I'm saying, what are you taking as your dominant logics? 5497-3148 at menti.com. These are the qualities of our belief system that we tend to default to again and again and again and again, no matter what we say, no matter what we do. Or put it another way, it takes a lot to change one of these things. Growth. Yeah, great, super. You're helping me do some research here on multifamily, so thank you so much. I'll credit all of you later. A few more things about dominant logics. They organize business practices, and this is one of the harder things to realize, that these dominant logics, which are so key to your success, get embedded into your business practices. What do I mean by business practices? Basically, the way you run your business, the way you monitor and control, the way you create products and services, the way you define a product and service, the way you think about customers, the way you go to market, how you treat your customers. What is a customer? The way you plan, the way you do strategy. And obviously in your people practices, your HR practices, and your social practices. But notice in this little picture that your people and HR and social stuff is only a small part of the equation. It's only a small part. And so here's another one of the great complexities about culture, is that dominant logics aren't only in people. They reside in our brains, but they get embedded in business practices because we create practices that we associate with success. It's in the way your company runs. And so that also means, and this is probably you've experienced this, people can come and go in an organization, but the culture doesn't change. Why? Because it's the business practices that carry the culture, not the people. That's one of the great paradoxes about culture. It's in our brains, but we create practices that perpetuate the culture. And unless those practices change, the culture won't change. And here's where we come to kind of the punchlines of all this. So one of the things about dominant logics that's important to know, and when we think about culture as a system, is this inverted pyramid picture. Dominant logics shape practices, and then at the top end of the inverted pyramid are the things that we typically think about when we think about culture. Conscious attitudes, norms, behavior, what it feels like around here. This is the sort of top layer. But the thing about what we normally think about culture is that we have to remember that many of these things are adaptations. The way when we do an employee survey and we are polling attitudes, we're actually looking at how people feel and what their attitudes are about something, but these are not necessarily culture or not the root of culture. They might be an expression or a compensation for or an adaptation to something deeper in the system. And here, when we treat the employee survey as the culture and the thing we have to go fix, is where we get into trouble because we're addressing symptoms but not necessarily the disease. And this is where we want everybody to be more collaborative. Well, the question we should be asking is, why are we not collaborative to begin with? What's deeper in our cultural system that's keeping us from collaboration? And what do we need to, can we address the deeper thing, i.e. the dominant logics, versus the symptom? So a few more examples of what we mean, just to drive the point home. The IRS, dominant, overused logics. A way of thinking about this is when a logic is overapplied or overused, it might look like this. The IRS is people in the IRS are generally suspicious of other employees and departments in the IRS. The safety culture that you see, the safety dominant logic that you see in airlines gets misapplied sometimes because airlines have a habit of merging very quickly, causing huge consternation among unions. For example, law firms, not only is the dominant logic of argument and win and lose, but everyone's an adversary, including your colleague, including your boss, and everything is an argument. In this consumer products company that we studied, departmental secrecy. So not only are we thinking about market intel and how to bring a new product like Crest toothpaste to market quickly, we're suspicious of the other functions who might steal our idea or leak it to the market, right? Microsoft, if you weren't working on some really hard problem, you basically weren't worth your salary at Microsoft. You got to be solving world hunger. You got to be solving the operating system. And this notion of platforms is prolific at Microsoft. Everything is a platform. If I'm writing a printer driver, I'm creating a printer platform that you have to write your code to my APIs. You think about that as at the scale of 100,000 people, that creates a lot of confusion. What's first, what's second, right? So you can see a little bit from these illustrations that these well-intentioned dominant logics that are core to our success, because we became successful as a result of doing these things in these ways over time, now can get us into trouble. And so here is back to our picture of culture. Here is where things get wonky for us because we think that culture is in the attitudes and the norms and the behavior, and yet where we need to intervene is right there. So we're looking for culture in all the wrong places. All right, so that's a little bit of the neuroscience. I want to just kind of double click into a case study because I want to bring this back to transformation. And an interesting case in the transformation arena is what's going on in industrial companies right now. One of our clients is this, I mentioned, 150, 160-year-old industrial company, and they have been trying to massively change their business because the digital revolution, digital transformation is impacting the industrial world in a massive way. And so this is a company characterized by manufacturing. It's an old-line manufacturing company, and they have dominant logics of making reliable products, or rather, their business practices, their existential moments, their professionalization, their hard problems that they've solved have been about reliability. They have been, also this particular company was a spin-off of a larger conglomerate. So on a given Friday in 2012, they were a division of a big company. On the Monday following, they were their own company, and that was an existential moment because suddenly the company had to be profitable and was listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and yet nothing had changed from the previous Friday. So this notion of having to be profitable was huge, and the company is also a collection of many, many smaller companies acquired over the years. So you can see that hard problems, the existential moment, and history are deeply involved in shaping the dominant logics of this company. And so you might then see that this company has strong dominant logics of financial performance. It's financial performance at all costs. It's certainty, which is another way of saying managing risk very closely, rule following, and a lot of sort of corporate versus field mentality. They try to become one company, and they're having a lot of trouble because there's a strong orientation and affiliation with local values and local brands, local products, etc. So some of the stuff that goes on in the company is an obsession about making the numbers every quarter, a strong belief system that hierarchy equals competence, meaning the boss is right. Even if the boss is wrong, the boss is right. You think about that in the software tech world, bosses are typically viewed with suspicion. It's the engineers who are right, the bosses are suits. In the industrial company, it's the boss is right, and even so, we might not disagree. We might not agree with what the boss has to say. We're going to go along anyway, because that's where the power lies. Minimizing risk in everything is dominant. It's very much a consensus culture, which is an expression of risk avoidance. Everybody gets along. Nobody argues. Nobody says anything particularly controversial in a meeting, even if they might have doubts. Nobody says anything because it's a consensus culture, a team-oriented culture, which is actually an expression of a risk aversion dominant logic. And lastly, these local businesses, these local franchises continue to operate as local franchises despite many years of trying to make them one company. So all that's interesting. None of that really matters because the company is actually quite successful. It's a highly successful company, stock price at an all-time high, a darling of Wall Street, a leader in their industry. This is all true. But they're trying to become a digital company, and here's the rub, and here's how this applies to you in the multifamily world. When you think about digital competencies, this is a study done by George Westerman and his colleagues at MIT, and what digital transformation looks like and what it requires in legacy companies. It usually has to do with these four competencies. Impact, making a big impact in the world, moving fast, the old Facebook adage, move fast and break things, being very open, engage many sources of information, data is king, don't hoard knowledge, so silos, it doesn't work in the digital world, and autonomy, high levels of discretion. The people with the best ideas might be the guy on the shop floor, might be the driver. It might be the operator. So you then think about the dominant logics of this industrial and what keeps it stuck in neutral in its digital transformation, which is what's happening, is that a financial performance logic or a certainty logic is going to impact the impact competency. Risk aversion is going to impact speed. Following rules is going to impact speed. corporate versus local is going to impact this idea of openness. Financial performance is going to impact openness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea that trying to become a digital company is undermined consistently by these logics. And it's all insidious. We don't really know it. It's just this company seems to get in its own way again and again and again for these reasons. So, to summarize a little bit, some common errors in culture change and business transformation related to these dominant logics. Number one, behavior is the wrong variable. And this is a big problem because we think culture change is about people and it is about behavior. Of course it is, but people are behaving for a reason, and usually behavior is contextual. It's an adaptation to something else that's going on in the system. Core values, well-intended. It's good to have a North Star as a company, a set of principles. I'm all for that. But core values don't drive behavior unless, and this is a big unless, they're deeply embedded in your business practices. And that's a lot easier said than done. Often also, core values are so generic and high level that they could apply to any company, anywhere, at any time on the planet, and that's meaningless. And it starts to actually breed cynicism in many cases. Here's the other big thing. When we think about culture as behavior and values, we tend to make it HR's problem or a talent problem. We just, if we got rid of all these bozos and brought in a whole new set of bozos, that's how we'll fix the culture. Wrong. At least the science is against you on that point because, again, the culture lives in the practices. The new bozos will become the old bozos very quickly because they're doing the same things according to your business practices. That's the problem. And how leaders behave, a few of you selected that in our initial survey. If we just get the leaders to walk the talk, this is one of my favorite ones, and role model the desired values, everybody will sort of magically do what they do. Well, that assumes that people are watching you as leaders, and newsflash, they're not. People are too busy putting food on the table and taking their kids to school and doing a good job at work and satisfying their customer. And this idea that we're spending time sort of obsessing over our leaders is just an artifact of our own narcissistic, idealized notion of leadership in this company and in this country and in Western culture. Leaders matter. They matter big time, but they don't matter because of role modeling. Leaders matter because leaders control practices. And so that's where we get into how do you change culture, how do you change dominant logics at scale? And the key is practices. You want to change the culture, you got to change the practices. And what I mean by practices is not behavior. Practices are not behavior. Practices are the things that entrain the behavior. And it's quite simple, actually, if you think about it. You want to get up, you want to be more productive? You want to lose 15 pounds? You want to stop eating sugar? You got to change your habits. This is well documented. You want to get up, you want to be more productive in the day, you got to wake up earlier. You got to set the alarm clock, you got to have the coffee ready, you got to have a comfortable bed so you get a good night's sleep. The practices are the bed, the alarm clock, the coffee, the things that go around creating the behavior change that you want. That works for individuals and it works for organizations too. It's the business practices, the way you budget, the way you plan, the way you engage customers, the way you think about customers, the way you do support, the way you do IT, the way you think about who gets which priorities, which are the priorities, and which organizational departments get those priorities. You get the idea. These are business practices. They're related to leaders, but it's the leaders who are setting up these practices that's where the culture resides. And so if you want to change culture, that's what you have to do. So here's a process. It's high level for how you do that. The first thing you have to do is target the logics, which of course requires identifying the dominant logics in your organization, which you've done pretty well on that last word cloud. But which of those are the biggest barriers to change? You're trying to change something, you're trying to go somewhere, but stuff gets in the way. That stuff tends to be these dominant beliefs and assumptions. Which ones and where are they? And which pose the greatest barrier to change. So have a target. And then, of course, the other part of it is identifying which practices these dominant logics tend to show up most in. In other words, where are these practices sustained the most? And can you influence them or influence the leaders or the holders of those practices to change? This is easier said than done because sometimes a lot of these practices are being vigorously defended. It's what made us successful. Don't mess with that. Don't mess with our budgeting process. Don't mess with the way we do customer support. It works, it made us successful. Yeah, but it's the barrier to change. Well, change something else, right? So you get the idea, right? So the other thing that matters then is, of course, you can't not do this alone. All of you who think of yourselves as change leaders in this room cannot go at dominant logics and a structure of culture that is so deep and so deeply embedded in history and legacy and solving hard problems. It's so deeply embedded in the neuroplastic brain. You can't go after this alone. You have to enroll a coalition of like-minded souls who also want to change the business, because in the business of change, in the business of culture change, in the business of transformation, there's absolute safety in numbers. You have to create what we call a power block. Easier said than done, but that's I'm trying to shape for you the landscape of how difficult it is to change some of this stuff. And doing it alone is usually, especially even if you're the CEO, because CEOs are accountable to boards, even as a CEO, you're liable to be shot at dawn because you're messing with the recipe that got us to success. And those of you who have tilted at that windmill in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. You've gone after something that's sacred in the organization and probably have the scars to show for it. And what that sacred thing is the dominant logic. So you've got to enroll a coalition and then engage those with authority. And then, of course, a lot of what then is required comes right from the design thinking world. The modern world is, don't try to change, don't try to build Rome in a day. Don't change your entire company. That would be foolish, because if you change every single dominant logic in your business, you're probably going to go out of business. So you need to pilot and incubate and find ways where you're trying to grow new logics. Think about it. You're trying to grow new neurons in a collective group of people, and you've got to create new practices where those new ways of thinking, that new brain chemistry can be entrained. And so piloting becomes very important. So this is kind of a high-level process. But 4 things just to leave you with, in my last slide here, and then I'll open it up for questions. 4 ideas to leave you with that you can start to do as leaders. And this goes back to the self-awareness comment that somebody made in the original word cloud, which I was very happy to see. This kind of culture change stuff that I'm talking about here, and the reason why 73% of change results in failure is because it's not for the faint of heart. And I think those of you who've led any change of any magnitude know this intuitively. It's not for the faint of heart, and you're not a bad person if you don't want to start to change your own organization. You have to do your own work first. What does that mean? Are you self-aware enough to know what your blind spots are? Do you have the courage? Do you have the skills? Because a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here requires hard conversations with people in power and people in authority and people who have history. And do you have the skills to have hard conversations? You can you can destroy a change initiative very quickly by having unskilled hard conversations. There is an art and a method and a science and a set of skills for having difficult conversations. But you need to have the difficult conversations. It isn't just, like status quo. What's in it for you? All of this is in the category of doing your own work, getting self-aware of what's in it for you. And maybe the answer is, I don't want to touch that thing. Let somebody else lead the change. Change leaders need to be very, very self-aware and do their own work first. The second thing about change, of the kind of change I'm talking about here, is surfacing and naming dominant logics. That might seem difficult for some of you, but it's actually no more complex than opening your eyes up to the pervasive patterns of your business. How do you guys and gals run yourselves and conduct yourselves every single day? Not just the behavior, the practices that lead to the behavior. And start naming that. And when you see a pattern that's usually an indication that that's a dominant logic. So can you see and name the patterns? Can you identify the practices where those patterns show up and go after them and bring others with you? I can't stress that enough. You cannot do this alone. Even if you're the CEO, even if you're a senior executive and highly paid and highly placed in your organization, you're going to need to enroll others in this. So with that, I will leave it there, a little bit of tour of the cognitive and neuroscience of culture.